a new girl walks into class, and the teacher's mask slips immediately. It started like any other Monday morning. The bell rang, students shuffled into their seats, and the air in room 3B carried that usual mix of sleepiness and tension. But something felt off today. Even before the first word was spoken, you could feel it hanging there, heavy, charged, almost waiting to explode. At the front of the class stood Ms. Weller, the kind of teacher who always insisted she was tough but fair. But anyone who'd spent more than a week in her class knew better. Her smile was never quite real. Her tone always had an edge, and for certain students, that fairness seemed to wear pretty thin. As the final stragglers took their seats, the door creaked open one last time. A new girl stepped into the room. She was quiet, poised, maybe 12, maybe 13. Her braids were pulled back neatly. She wore a plain burgundy t-shirt and clutched a notebook to her chest like it was armor. Her name was Layla. And in that moment, with every set of eyes turning to look at her, she walked into more than just a classroom. She walked straight into a storm. Ms. Weller's gaze snapped toward her like a hawk spotting prey. Her smile tightened, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Ah," she said, voice syrupy sweet. "Our transfer student has arrived." Layla gave a polite nod. "Good morning." The teacher gestured vaguely to the empty seat near the front, the one nobody ever wanted. "Go on and sit there, dear. I hope you're ready to keep up with the rest of the class. We move pretty fast around here." She said it like a joke, but no one laughed. The words hung in the air with a weight that felt like something more than sarcasm. Layla didn't flinch. She just nodded again and walked slowly to the desk, all eyes on her. Some students looked curious, others wary, and a few smirked, already sensing blood in the water. Miss Weller turned to the whiteboard, her back to the class. Today we're continuing our discussion on Of Mice and Men, themes of loneliness, power, and where people fit in society. Her marker squeaked across the board, but her eyes flicked back in Layla's direction. You could feel it, something tightening, a slow winding of tension like a rubber band about to snap. Layla opened her notebook and started to take notes, calm and focused. But the teacher's tone shifted, just slightly. "Let's talk about power," Ms. Weller said, turning back around. "Who has it, who doesn't, and why? Any thoughts?" Layla raised her hand. The teacher looked right past it. "Pick someone else." And just like that, the message was clear. You're not here to speak. You're here to be quiet. But Layla kept her hand up anyway. Not aggressive, not desperate. Just steady, unmoving. Ms. Weller finally turned to her with a tight-lipped smile. "Yes? Layla, is it?" Layla nodded. "I think the book shows how systems of inequality keep certain people powerless, especially." "Oh," the teacher interrupted, waving her hand. "Let's not make this political. We're talking about literature here, not whatever you saw on TikTok." A few kids chuckled. A few looked down. Layla sat still. Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes didn't blink. "I was actually referring to a quote from the book." "That's quite enough," Ms. Weller snapped, her voice suddenly sharper. "Let's stick to the real themes, please." Layla closed her notebook, slowly, quietly. But that silence? It said everything. And Ms. Weller had no idea who was already listening. Just one door away. She tries to speak up during discussion, but gets shut down hard. The next day, Layla came to class early, sat in the same front row seat, opened her notebook. No headphones, no distractions, just focus. You'd think a teacher would be impressed by that, but not Ms. Weller. From the moment she walked in, you could feel her energy shift the room. She barely looked at Layla as she took attendance. Her voice was clipped, her tone colder than usual. Like Layla's presence alone had thrown off her balance, and she was determined to reassert control. "All right, Mrs. Weller began, pacing slowly across the room. "Today we're going deeper into the symbolism in Of Mice and Men. Let's talk about the idea of dreams. Who gets to dream? and who doesn't. Hands went up. Layla raised hers too. Calm, confident. Miss Weller scanned the room, then deliberately skipped over her. "Ryan," she called on a boy in the back who'd barely even read the book. He stumbled through a vague answer about people having goals or whatever, and Miss Weller nodded, like it was profound. Layla's hand stayed up, still ignored. Another student answered, then another. Finally, after the third round, Ms. Weller sighed, like she was doing Layla a favor, and called on her. "Yes, Layla. Something to add?" Layla nodded. "Yes. I think the novel shows how some characters' dreams are dismissed because of their race or disability, like crooks." Miss Weller cut her off immediately. "Let's not go off on tangents." Layla blinked. "It's not a tangent." "It is," the teacher snapped. "We're analyzing literary elements, not turning this into a social studies debate." A low murmur rippled through the class. A few kids shifted uncomfortably. A couple whispered to each other, already more entertained by the tension than the lesson. Layla sat up straighter, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "With respect," she said, her voice clear and measured, "it's not a debate. It's part of the story. The author included those details to show how." Miss Weller's voice rose over hers. "This is not a space for pushing personal agendas. If you can't stay on topic, you may want to reconsider your participation grade." Participation grade. It wasn't just about the book anymore. It was about putting her in her place. Layla didn't move, didn't argue, but the way she looked at Miss Weller, it wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was disappointment. Quiet, piercing disappointment. The kind that says, "I expected better, even from you." And that look, it made the teacher flinch just for a second. But instead of backing down, Miss Weller turned away and wrote a question on the board in huge capital letters. What happens when people don't know their place? She didn't say it out loud, but everyone in that room knew exactly who it was directed at. And no one, not even Miss Weller, noticed the figure standing just outside the door, arms crossed, listening, watching everything. The teacher escalates, calling her out for attitude and talking back. By Wednesday, it wasn't subtle anymore. Whatever mask Ms. Weller had been wearing on Monday had completely cracked. Her tone toward Layla wasn't just cold now. It was sharp, petty, barely veiled. It started early that morning. Layla walked in like usual, polite and prepared. But the moment she stepped through the door, Miss Weller's eyes narrowed. 5 minutes early, she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Trying to make a statement, are we?" Layla paused, confused. "No, ma'am. That's fine," Ms. Weller cut her off. "You'll find out soon enough that effort alone doesn't equal excellence." It was the kind of line that made the whole class go quiet. Layla said nothing. She sat down and opened her notebook like she always did. But now the tension wasn't just between her and the teacher. It had spread. The other students could feel it too. Some stared. Some looked away, but no one said a word. As the lesson began, the teacher's scrutiny intensified. Every time Layla adjusted in her seat, Miss Weller's eyes were there. Every time Layla raised her hand, it was ignored or dismissed. And then came the breaking point. "Can anyone tell me what George's decision at the end of the novel represents?" Ms. Weller asked, scanning the room. Layla raised her hand again, slow, deliberate, just like before. The teacher stared at her, then smirked. "Well, someone's feeling very opinionated today," she said, folding her arms. "Let's see what brilliant insight we have this time." Layla didn't flinch. "I think George's choice shows the complexity of mercy, especially in a world where people like Lenny don't get real protection." Miss Weller blinked. "I see. So now we're rewriting the meaning of the book entirely." Layla tried again, this time a little more firmly. "I'm not rewriting it. I'm just interpreting the moral tension in that scene. George is." "Layla," the teacher snapped, raising her voice. If you're going to insist on constantly challenging the way I teach this class, maybe you should spend a little more time listening than lecturing." A gasp escaped from somewhere near the back. A few kids exchanged glances. And then, just like that, the word dropped. "Attitude," Miss Weller said. "That's the real issue here, isn't it?" Layla blinked. "Excuse me? You may not realize it, but this attitude of yours, it's disruptive. You speak as if you know more than your teacher, and that's not just disrespectful, it's unacceptable." Now the classroom felt like a courtroom. Every eye was on Layla. But she didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just said 6 words. "I'm allowed to have a voice." And that sentence, quiet, controlled, unwavering, shook something loose in the room. Because it wasn't attitude. It was truth. But Miss Weller didn't want truth. She wanted silence. And what no one knew, not yet, was that someone was in the hallway again. Same spot, listening carefully, watching this unfold. And this time, he wasn't just concerned. He was furious. Other students fall silent, or worse, join in. By Thursday, the classroom didn't feel like a learning space anymore. It felt like a trap. Every time Layla walked in, it was like stepping onto a stage she never auditioned for, with an audience ready to either watch her fall or pretend they didn't see it. The worst part? It wasn't just Miss Weller anymore. Some of the students had started to pick up on her behavior and copy it. It started small, an eye roll here, a whispered comment there, but it grew, fast. That morning, as Layla opened her notebook, she noticed a gum wrapper stuffed inside, crushed and sticky. No one around her claimed to know where it came from, but a few kids were already smirking. She said nothing. When Ms. Weller walked in, she didn't ask how it got there either. Instead, she glanced at the wrapper on Layla's desk, raised an eyebrow, and muttered under her breath, "Some habits die hard, I guess." The class laughed. Layla didn't. She picked up the wrapper, dropped it in the trash, and returned to her seat, calm, composed, but her hands, they were shaking. During discussion, she tried again to contribute, gently, carefully, only for the teacher to interrupt and call on someone else. One boy, Jason, turned around in his seat and whispered, "Maybe let the teacher talk for once?" It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The ripple of laughter that followed made Layla's ears burn. Ms. Weller didn't say a word. She heard it. She ignored it. That silence? That was the permission they needed. From that point on, the classroom split. Some kids, like Sarah and Malik, stayed quiet, eyes lowered, clearly uncomfortable. They didn't laugh, but they didn't speak up either. Others? They got bolder. Comments like, "She always thinks she's right," or "Is she trying to be the teacher now?" became whispers that circled the room. And every time, Layla just kept writing. Head down, pen steady, back straight. Not because she was okay, but because she refused to break. And through it all, Ms. Weller never once stepped in, never redirected the class, never reminded anyone of respect or kindness or empathy. Instead, she let it happen. Because in her eyes, Layla deserved it. And while the students were too wrapped up in the drama to notice, someone else was watching. Behind the cracked classroom door, a figure stood once again. He heard the gum comment. He saw the laughter. He took notes. And this time, he was done waiting. She's accused of chewing gum, even though she's not. Friday. The air felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Layla had barely set her backpack down when Ms. Weller zeroed in on her. She hadn't even opened her notebook yet. She was just sitting there, calm and quiet, which by now seemed to irritate the teacher more than anything else. Miss Weller narrowed her eyes. She said sharply, tapping a stack of papers against her desk. "Miss Layla, are you chewing gum?" Layla blinked. "No, ma'am." The teacher tilted her head, lips pursed. "Really?" Because I could have sworn I saw you chewing. Layla's brows knit together, confused. I'm not chewing anything. The class froze. Everyone turned to look. Miss Weller walked forward, slowly, deliberately. Are you sure? She asked, like it was a trap. Because if I find out you're lying, that's a detention. Layla sat up straighter. I'm not lying. But Miss Weller wasn't backing off. Well, to be safe, why don't you go ahead and spit it out? Trash can's right over there. Layla paused. She glanced around the room. Half the class was staring. Some students looked uncomfortable. Others were already snickering under their breath. She wasn't chewing gum. There was nothing to spit out. But this wasn't about gum. It never had been. This was about power. And Ms. Weller was trying to make a point. So Layla stood. Slowly, without saying a word, she walked to the trash can, stared into it for a beat, then mimed spitting something out. Her hand moved like she was flicking a real piece of gum from her fingers. Then she walked back to her desk. Silent, dignified, and furious. Miss Weller gave a tight smile. Thank you. Let's try to follow the rules next time. Layla didn't answer. She just picked up her pen and kept writing. But the classroom wasn't the same after that. Even the students who had laughed looked unsettled now. The performance was too much, too calculated, too cruel. And one girl, Sarah, bit her lip and glanced toward the door. Because she thought she saw something move out there. A shadow. A presence. What she didn't know was that Layla's father was standing in that hallway. Not just a parent, not just a concerned father, but the principal of the school. And he'd heard every single word. The girl stays composed, but inside, she's boiling. Layla didn't say a word for the rest of the class, but her silence was louder than anything else in the room. Her pen moved across the page with machine-like precision, her jaw set tight, her breathing controlled. Every click of her pen, every shift of her hand felt like resistance, like protest, like a fire that had to burn low because exploding would give them exactly what they wanted. And Ms. Weller knew it. She kept glancing at Layla, not with concern, not even curiosity, but irritation, as if Layla's quiet composure was somehow more threatening than any outburst. As if staying calm, staying focused, staying unbothered was a form of defiance she couldn't tolerate. And in some ways, it was. Because Layla wasn't backing down. Not after being humiliated in front of the entire class. Not after being accused of lying. Not after the teacher's fake smile, the fake thank you, and the not-so-fake message. You don't belong here. But Layla's shoulders didn't slump. Her voice didn't crack. She just kept taking notes on Of Mice and Men, on power and oppression, on who gets to speak and who gets silenced. Around her, the class had shifted. The laughs had faded. The whispers had stopped. Even the ones who had joined in earlier were quiet now, eyes flicking nervously between Layla and the front of the room. Because deep down, they knew what they'd just witnessed wasn't discipline. It was targeting, and they also knew something else. Layla wasn't the type to let this slide. As the bell rang and the students began to pack up, Ms. Weller raised her voice one last time. Don't forget, she called out, group project presentations are on Monday. I hope you're all taking them seriously. Her eyes landed squarely on Layla. Layla nodded, slowly. I am. Her voice was calm. But behind her eyes, you could see it. She was done playing nice. Because this presentation, it wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice in front of the very people who tried to take it. And out in the hallway, Principal James King stood frozen, fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't ready to step in just yet. But when he did, he was going to make sure everyone remembered it. She gives a brilliant presentation, and the teacher tries to destroy it. Monday came faster than anyone expected. But for Layla, it didn't matter. She'd been preparing for this all weekend, not because she was afraid, but because she knew. She knew this presentation was her moment, her chance to speak, uninterrupted, unfiltered, and undeniable. When Ms. Weller called her group up to present, the classroom fell quiet. Layla walked to the front with her notes tucked neatly in a folder. Her partners were nervous, but she wasn't. Not this time. The board behind them displayed their topic, Power and Silence in Of Mice and Men. Layla had picked it herself, and now she was ready to unpack it. She began speaking, her voice clear and steady. She talked about the characters who were silenced in the book, Crooks, Lenny, Curly's wife, and how each of them represented a different kind of exclusion. She cited passages word for word. She referenced literary scholars. She brought in historical context. Her points were sharp. Her pacing was flawless. Even the students who had rolled their eyes at her last week were now sitting up straighter, listening. For a few minutes, Layla had the room, until Ms. Weller decided she'd had enough. She raised her hand mid-sentence, cutting off Layla's flow. "Layla," she said, voice syrupy, "don't you think you're focusing a bit too much on race and gender? There's more to the novel than that, isn't there?" Layla paused. "I'm discussing the author's use of silence and power structures." "Yes, but let's be fair," Miss Weller interrupted. "We don't want to turn everything into a social issue, do we?" A few students looked away. One or two snickered. Layla stared at the teacher. "I'm analyzing the text," she said firmly, "with quotes, sources, and historical context. Isn't that what this assignment is for?" Ms. Weller's smile tightened. "What I meant is that we should focus on universal themes, something more balanced, not so emotionally driven." Layla felt her hands clench at her sides. So silence and inequality aren't universal? The tension snapped like a rubber band. The class froze. Ms. Weller's face flushed. "This tone, Layla, is exactly what I meant last week when I talked about your attitude. If you can't present respectfully—" "I am being respectful," Layla cut in, "but I won't water down the truth just because it makes you uncomfortable." You could have heard a pin drop. Then, slowly, someone in the back clapped. One, then two, then the front row. Ms. Weller's face twisted, but she said nothing. For once, she was outnumbered. Layla stood tall. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just looked at the woman who tried to humiliate her and said, "If the truth offends you, maybe you're not listening close enough." And from the hallway, beyond the open door, a familiar presence watched. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. But he was ready. Because the moment this class ended, everything was going to change. One brave student finally speaks up and pays the price. The bell hadn't even rung yet, but the tension in room 3B was already suffocating. After Layla's presentation, the air was thick with something unspoken. Students were buzzing with silent energy, but no one dared say a word out loud. Not yet. Layla had gone back to her seat, calm on the outside, burning on the inside. Ms. Weller, still at the front of the room, shuffled through papers with more force than necessary. Her cheeks were red. Her smile had disappeared. And even though she hadn't addressed it directly, you could tell she'd taken Layla's defiance personally. "All right," she said, barely hiding her irritation. "Let's move on to the next group. Hopefully, we can keep things a little more academic this time." And that's when it happened. A hand went up. It wasn't Layla's. It was Sarah's, the quiet girl from the front row, the one who always kept her head down, the one who never said a word unless called on. Miss Weller looked surprised. "Yes? Sarah?" Sarah cleared her throat nervously. I just wanted to say I thought Layla's presentation was powerful and accurate. I learned a lot." A quiet ripple passed through the room. Layla looked up, shocked. Their eyes met. Sarah gave her a small, almost trembling smile. But Miss Weller? Her face went cold. "I see," she said, voice sharp. "Well, Sarah, while I appreciate your Enthusiasm. I don't recall asking for commentary on another student's work. Sarah blinked. I just thought it was relevant. It wasn't, the teacher snapped. Let's stay focused, shall we? The entire class froze again. It wasn't just the words. It was the tone. That tone, the same one she'd used on Layla, was now aimed at Sarah, dismissive, belittling, designed to shut her down. Sarah shrank back in her seat, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She looked down at her desk, lips pressed into a thin line. And in that moment, something shifted. Because everyone saw it. The mask was off. This wasn't about discipline, or academics, or structure. This was about control. And now Ms. Weller had shown her hand, not just with Layla, but with anyone who dared to disagree. A couple of students started to whisper. One boy muttered, "Seriously?" under his breath. Another nudged Sarah, offering a quiet, supportive look. And Layla? She didn't say anything. She just watched. Because now she wasn't the only target. Now someone else had taken a risk. And while Miss Weller tried to move on with the lesson, her voice was strained, her posture rigid. She had lost control of the room, and she knew it. But she didn't know the half of it, because in less than 5 minutes, the door was going to open. And when it did, every mask, every lie, every calculated humiliation was about to collapse. In front of the entire class, then comes a knock on the door, and everything changes. Ms. Weller stood at the front of the class, rattling through the next assignment like nothing had happened. But everyone could feel it, the tension, the shift. It was in the way Sarah refused to make eye contact, in the way Layla sat completely still, no longer hiding her frustration, in the way the rest of the class avoided the teacher's gaze altogether. Ms. Weller wasn't teaching anymore. She was scrambling to regain control. "Group essays will be due Friday," she barked, voice clipped. "And I expect academic analysis, not political soapboxes." She looked straight at Layla as she said it. Layla didn't react. She just raised her eyebrows slightly, calm, unbothered. And then there was a knock. 3 sharp taps at the classroom door. Everyone turned. Ms. Weller looked irritated. "Class isn't over," she muttered, walking briskly toward the door. "Whatever it is can wait." But when she opened it, she stopped cold. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a navy suit, hands folded calmly in front of him. His posture was composed, his eyes serious, but there was something beneath the surface, something steady and firm, like steel behind glass. Layla's eyes widened just slightly. She knew that stance. Principal James King. Her father? Ms. Weller didn't. Not yet. "Oh," she said, her voice changing to that overly sweet tone she used with other staff. "Principal King? What a surprise." He nodded. "Good morning, Miss Weller. May I come in?" "Of course," she said quickly, stepping aside. "We were just finishing up presentations. I was just telling the students how important it is to keep discussions appropriate and academic." He stepped inside. The class went dead silent. You could hear a pencil drop. Principal King's eyes scanned the room. Slowly, thoughtfully, they landed on Sarah, then Jason, then finally on Layla. And they softened. Just for a second. Not a word passed between them, but the look said everything. He turned to Ms. Weller. "I'd like to speak with you, privately. Now." Her smile faltered. "Yes, of course. Is there a concern? We'll talk in the hallway." He turned to the class. "Students, please remain seated. This won't take long." And then, as Ms. Weller stepped out into the hallway, flustered, confused, still trying to figure out what was happening, the door clicked shut behind them. Inside, the students buzzed with silent energy. They looked at each other, at Layla, at the empty front of the room. No one said anything out loud, but they all felt it. Something just shifted. something big. Layla didn't move. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just sat there, back straight, eyes forward. Because for the first time all week, the power wasn't in the front of the room anymore. It was in her seat. The teacher is exposed, and the school is never the same again. It didn't take long. Just 10 minutes behind that door. 10 minutes of Principal King calmly listening, then asking one pointed question after another. 10 minutes of Ms. Weller stammering through excuses, of backpedaling, of trying to reframe everything she'd said over the past week as misunderstandings and miscommunications. But the damage had already been done. When the door finally opened again, the classroom turned in unison. Principal King stepped in first, calm, composed, and commanding. Ms. Weller followed behind him, her face pale and her hands clenched into tight fists. Her entire posture had changed. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her own words had finally caught up to her. Principal King walked to the front of the class. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on a desk. He didn't have to. Before we continue, he said, looking slowly around the room, I want to talk to you all about something far more important than any lesson plan. The students sat still. You could hear breathing. This past week, he continued, something unacceptable has been happening in this classroom. And I want to be very clear. When a student is repeatedly dismissed, humiliated, or treated unfairly, that's not discipline. That's discrimination. He looked directly at Layla, and then back at the class. And it has no place in this school. A ripple of realization spread across the room. It was true. All of it. He wasn't just making a vague statement. He was calling it out, naming it, confronting it. Ms. Weller opened her mouth, probably to defend herself, but Principal King didn't give her the space. Ms. Weller will be taking administrative leave effective immediately, he said, voice firm. There will be a full investigation. In the meantime, another teacher will take over this classroom. The room was silent until a student in the back whispered, "Whoa." And then something incredible happened. Sarah, the girl who had spoken up earlier, clapped once, then twice. Then Jason joined. Then the front row, and within seconds, the entire class was clapping, loud, unapologetic, unified. Ms. Weller stood frozen, blinking at the sound. But Layla? She didn't clap. She didn't need to. She just looked at her teacher, the woman who spent a week trying to silence her, and said quietly, "You heard me now." As Ms. Weller gathered her things and left the room for the last time, the applause faded into quiet murmurs. Some students looked stunned. Others looked relieved. A few looked inspired. Because they just witnessed something powerful. Not just a teacher being held accountable, but a student, a Black girl, taking back her power in the most graceful, unshakable way possible. And as the principal stood beside her, the truth landed. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to fight dirty. She just needed to be heard. And now, she was. Later that week, a new teacher arrived, one who listened. The school launched new training on bias and inclusion, and whispers started floating about a student-led diversity council. Layla was asked to lead it, not because she had fought, but because she'd stood her ground. And because silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. And sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. Have you ever witnessed someone finally stand up to injustice and win? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because speaking up changes everything.